Every winter in the hills of eastern Tennessee, when the ground froze hard enough to crack bones and the nights stretched longer than memory, one enslaved man was summoned indoors, not to eat, not to warm himself by the fire, but to lie silently between two women who shared blood, secrets, and a fear so old it had no name. For 10 winters he slept there without speaking, without touching, without ever being acknowledged in daylight. In the summer of 1815, the house woke one morning and he was gone. No footprints, no blood, no sale record, only 2 cousins who never spoke to each other again, and a plantation that began to rot from the inside out. The winter that began this story did not announce itself with snow but with silence, a thick, listening quiet that settled over the Harrowick estate like a held breath. Because in the hills of eastern Tennessee the cold did not rush in all at once. It crept, it tested, it waited to see who would notice first, and the Harrowick house always noticed before anyone else, its timbers contracting with soft arthritic groans, its upper windows frosting from the inside as though something within exhaled long before the fire was lit. And it was during these first nights of cold, when the river slowed and the woods seemed to pull closer, that the cousins began locking their bedroom door again, a habit learned in childhood and never spoken of aloud. Eliza Harrowick was the elder by 3 years, sharp-eyed, precise in her movements, a woman whose voice carried authority even when she whispered, while Margaret was softer in manner but no less watchful, her silences longer, her expression slower to change, as though she measured the weight of every thought before allowing it to surface, and together they had inherited not just the land but the house's memory, a legacy stitched into the walls with nails and prayers, and something older that had never learned to sleep. Their parents had died within months of each other, fever they said, though no one could remember a single cough, and the girls had been raised inside the same room where they now slept as grown women, taught early that winter was not a season but a condition, one that demanded obedience. Each year, as the cold sharpened, the servants noticed the same signs, Eliza's hands trembling when she held her teacup, Margaret pacing the upstairs corridor long after midnight, the door to the unused west room opening on its own despite being barred, and the faint sound of footsteps above the ceiling even when the attic ladder remained untouched. This was when the cousins would finally send for him, always after sunset, always without explanation, and always with the same instruction delivered through the housekeeper's tight mouth, "Bring Isaac upstairs." Isaac had been on the property since boyhood, purchased quietly, never registered for field work, never beaten in public, a man shaped by absence rather than force, tall and narrow-shouldered, his gaze lowered not from submission but from an instinct to survive unnoticed, and by day he existed on the edges of the estate like a shadow that belonged to no object, sleeping in a narrow shed behind the smokehouse, eating after everyone else, spoken about but never spoken to, as though language itself might bind him more tightly than chains. The other enslaved people were warned early never to ask why Isaac was different, never to follow him at night, never to step near the upstairs room once winter took hold, because there were rules in that house that did not appear in ledgers, rules passed mouth to ear, mother to daughter, always halting, always fearful, and those rules said that when the frost came hard enough to split the ground, someone living had to stand between the Harrowick blood and whatever followed it. On the night this story truly begins, the air smelled of iron and frozen leaves, the river groaned under its first skin of ice, and Isaac was led through the back stairs with a lantern threw more shadow than light, each step creaking as if the house were counting them, measuring whether the pattern had been followed correctly. Eliza stood by the bed fully dressed, her hair braided tight against her skull, Margaret already lying on the far side beneath a quilt she did not pull up to her chin, their faces pale not with fear exactly but with expectation, the kind that comes from knowing pain and waiting for it to arrive on schedule. Isaac was told nothing new, because nothing ever changed. Lie down, face the ceiling, do not speak, do not touch, do not leave until morning. And as he stretched himself between them, his body rigid, his hands resting flat against his own ribs, he felt again the familiar shift in the room, the temperature dropping just enough to sting, the air thickening as though something unseen leaned closer, curious, Testing, always testing. Outside, the servants banked the fires and barred the doors, pretending not to hear the soft, rhythmic knock that sometimes came from inside the walls, and somewhere deep in the house, wood pressed against wood with the sound of teeth grinding. This had happened every winter for 10 years, and each time the house survived, the cousins survived, the bruises that sometimes bloomed on their skin fading by morning, the whispers receding like a tide that had not yet learned to claim what it was owed. And Isaac would be returned to his shed at dawn, his presence erased until the cold returned again. But this winter felt heavier, older somehow, as though the land itself remembered something it had tried to forget, and Isaac felt it too, a pressure behind his eyes, a sense of being watched not by the women on either side of him, but by something that recognized him now, something that had learned his shape, his breath, his patience. If you feel that slow tightening in your chest right now, if stories like this make you lean closer instead of pulling away, then this is where you belong. Subscribe to Born into Darkness, hit the bell icon so you don't miss what history buried on purpose, and leave a comment telling me how deeply this beginning has already settled into you, because this winter was only the first chapter, and what the Harrowick house demanded before spring would echo far beyond its walls. By the third night after Isaac was returned to his shed, the house began to miscount him, and that was when everything started to slip, because the Harrowick estate had always been a place that depended on patterns the way a body depends on breath, and once a pattern faltered, the consequences rippled outward in ways no one could fully see at first. Winter deepened quickly that year, faster than it ever had before, the kind of cold that did not simply settle on the land but pressed into it. Flattening sound, sharpening shadows, making even familiar paths feel slightly misaligned. And Isaac felt this shift more keenly than anyone else, because his life had always been measured in quiet warnings and small deviations that meant survival or punishment. In the shed, wrapped in a threadbare blanket that smelled of smoke and old hay, he lay awake listening to the house breathe across the yard, its upper windows dark but not blind, its roofline jagged against a sky too clear for comfort, and he knew, with a certainty that had nothing to do with reason, that something inside those walls had begun to notice the space he left behind when he walked back downstairs each morning. It was not hunger exactly, not yet, but recognition, the way a wound recognizes the absence of pressure and begins to throb in protest. Isaac had never been told the full story, only fragments overheard, warnings spoken when adults thought children asleep, the kind of half-words that linger longer than complete truths. But over the years he had learned enough to understand that his presence upstairs was not protection in the way people usually meant it. It was containment, a living weight placed carefully bet. Two bloodlines and an inheritance that did not belong to land or money, but to a promise made badly and kept worse. Long before Eliza and Margaret were born, before their parents and grandparents, there had been another Harrowick winter, one remembered only in ledger margins and sermons that skipped certain years, when a woman carrying twins had locked herself in that same room and prayed to anything that would listen for deliverance from a birth she believed cursed, and when the children came, only one lived, the other stillborn but warm, its skin unmarked, its eyes open, and the midwife who witnessed it had gone mad before spring, screaming about a third breath in the room, a breath that did not belong to any living thing. That story had been pressed down, reshaped, retold as fever or hysteria, but something had stayed behind, something that learned the sound of Harrowick blood and followed it through generations. Growing stronger each winter, it was acknowledged and weaker when it was denied. Isaac had been introduced into that cycle not by accident but by desperation, chosen because he did not share their blood, because his presence altered the balance of the room, grounding it in flesh and warmth and a life that could be taken without consequence, a living barrier that confused whatever waited in the dark long enough for dawn to come. But now, as the night stretched and the frost crept higher on the windows, Isaac began to dream in ways he never had before, dreams that did not fade when he woke but clung to him like damp cloth, dreams of standing in the upstairs room alone, the bed empty, the walls pulsing softly as if they had veins, dreams where a voice spoke his name without sound, shaping it inside his skull, tasting it, and each morning he rose more exhausted than the night before, his body sore as though he had been moving while asleep. The other enslaved workers noticed changes too, though no one dared name them, the way Isaac sometimes paused mid-step as if listening to something no one else could hear, the way he flinched when the wind rattled the house, the way he began refusing food on certain nights, claiming sickness when the truth was closer to fear, because deep down he understood something the Harowick cousins themselves were only beginning to suspect. The house was no longer satisfied with the old arrangement. Upstairs, Eliza and Margaret felt it first in their bones, a restlessness that sleep could not touch, the sense that the room was too large and too small at the same time, that the space between them at night stretched and contracted unpredictably, and on the fourth night, when they sent for Isaac again, the housekeeper returned pale and shaking, saying she could not find him, that his shed was empty, his blanket folded neatly on the cot, as if he had risen willingly and left without resistance. Panic spread quietly through the house, contained by habit and fear, but Eliza's hands shook openly now, her voice snapping as she ordered searches of the yard, the woods, the riverbank, while Margaret stood unnaturally still, her eyes fixed on the closed bedroom door, as if listening for something that had already begun to whisper. They found no tracks, no signs of struggle, no footprints leading away, only the impression of bare feet in frost that appeared and vanished within a few steps, as though Isaac had simply been lifted from the ground. That night the cousins locked themselves in the room anyway, pushing the dresser against the door, lighting every candle they owned, clinging to the hope that routine alone might hold whatever waited at bay. But the room felt wrong without him, the air thinner, sharper, the shadows deeper, and sometime after midnight the knocking began again, not from the walls this time, but from beneath the floor, slow and deliberate, 3 knocks, a pause, then 3 more, each one vibrating up through the bedframe and into their bones. Margaret began to cry quietly, the sound, pulled from her without permission, while Eliza pressed her palms against her ears, whispering prayers that tangled together and lost meaning, and still the knocking continued, closer now, as though something were learning the shape of the room from below. Somewhere in the house, a door opened by itself, hinges squealing in protest, and the wind carried a sound that might have been Isaac's voice, stretched thin, calling not for help but for release. And in that moment, both women understood with terrifying clarity that whatever had taken him had not removed him from the cycle but folded him deeper into it, transforming him from barrier into offering. As dawn finally crept in, pale and weak, the knocking stopped, leaving behind a silence so complete it rang, and when the cousins dared move the dresser and open the door, they found the hallway scarred with long, shallow grooves, as if something had been dragged across the floor, something heavy, something unwilling, and in the far corner, beneath the attic ladder that no one had climbed in years, lay a single footprint pressed into dust, barefoot, toes splayed, pointing not away from the house but toward its heart, and though no one spoke Isaac's name aloud after that, it lingered in every room, in every shadow, in the uneasy knowledge that winter had not yet finished asking for what it believed was owed. Morning did not bring relief so much as it brought a new note of dread, a thin, ringing awareness that whatever had begun in the night was now awake and patient, and the Harowick house carried that awareness the way old wood carries damp, invisibly but everywhere at once, so that every step echoed wrong, and every door seemed to hesitate before opening, as if considering whether it should remain closed. Word of Isaac's disappearance moved through the estate like a held breath, not loud enough to be called panic, but heavy enough to bend posture and quiet voices, and among the enslaved quarters there was a sudden, unspoken understanding that something had broken its boundary, because Isaac had been known, in the careful way such things were ever known, that something had broken its boundary, because Isaac had been known, in the careful way such things were ever known, as a constant, a presence that moved between worlds and returned unchanged, and now that constancy was gone. Some said he had run, though no one believed it, because there had been chances before, better chances than a frozen night with no supplies and no trail, and others whispered that the river had taken him, but the river had been frozen solid and offered no answers, only a smooth, unbroken surface that reflected the sky too clearly to be trusted. In the big house, Eliza retreated into command, issuing orders with sharp efficiency, trying to reassert a sense of control through motion, while Margaret drifted in the opposite direction, moving slowly, touching walls as she passed, her fingers lingering on door frames and banisters as though the house itself might speak to her if she listened closely enough. It was Margaret who first noticed the smell, faint at first, easy to dismiss as rot or damp or old plaster, but unmistakably wrong once named, a coppery sweetness that came and went with no clear source, strongest near the stairs and weakest in open air, and when she mentioned it to Eliza, her cousin snapped that she was imagining things, that fear had a way of inventing sensations, but even as she spoke, Eliza's face paled, because she smelled it too. By the third day, the house began to mark time differently. Clocks falling out of sync, candles burning unevenly, shadows lingering where light should have erased them, and at night, the knocking returned, no longer beneath the floor but within the walls themselves, traveling slowly from room to room, mapping the interior like a hand learning a familiar face. The servants stopped sleeping altogether, gathering in small groups, whispering prayers from different traditions that overlapped and tangled, and some spoke of leaving, though none did, because the land had a way of holding P.E. Opal, not with chains but with the quiet certainty that escape would cost more than staying. On the fourth night after Isaac vanished, Margaret woke to the sound of breathing that was not her own or Eliza's, a soft, steady rhythm that seemed to come from everywhere at once, and when she sat up, heart hammering, she saw a shape at the foot of the bed. Not solid enough to be called a body, but dense enough to block the candlelight, and in that moment she understood what the stories had always circled without naming. The thing that haunted the Harrowick winters was not a ghost in the way people liked to imagine, not a remnant or a memory, but something alive in its own fashion, something that grew and learned and adapted, something that required acknowledgement to remain contained. The shape did not move closer, did not reach out, but it tilted, as if curious, and though it had no visible mouth, Margaret felt words press into her thoughts, not spoken but placed there gently, insistently, asking where the other one was, asking why the balance had been disturbed, asking what offering would be made to set it right. She screamed then, the sound tearing from her throat, and Eliza woke instantly, fumbling for the candle, her own fear flaring as the light revealed nothing at the foot of the bed, only empty space and the lingering sense of having been watched. From that night on, Margaret began to change, her sleep fractured by waking dreams, her speech slowing, her eyes unfocused, as if part of her attention had been diverted elsewhere, and she began to say Isaac's name aloud, not often, but at odd moments, as though responding to someone who had spoken first. Eliza tried to intervene, to call for doctors, preachers, anyone who might explain or fix what was happening, but each attempt ended in frustration, the doctors finding no illness they could name, the preachers offering prayers that fell flat against the weight in the air, and one older minister, after a single night in the house, refusing to return, muttering about old sins and older bargains as he fled before dawn. Meanwhile, small things began to go wrong across the estate, livestock found drained of blood with no wounds to explain it, frost forming overnight in rooms with lit fires, a child claiming to have seen a man standing in the trees watching the house, barefoot and unmoving, his eyes reflecting light like an animal's. When Eliza heard that description, something inside her finally cracked, because she had dreamed of Isaac too, dreamed of him standing at the edge of the yard, his face unreadable, his mouth opening as if to speak, only for blackness to pour out instead of words, and she began to suspect what she had never allowed herself to consider before, that Isaac's role had never been passive, that he had not simply been placed between the cousins but had, over time, become part of the mechanism that held the thing at bay, learning its rhythms, absorbing its attention, feeding it just enough to keep it dormant. The idea horrified her, not only because of what it implied about Isaac's suffering, but because it suggested that by removing him, by allowing him to be taken, They had accelerated a process that could no longer be reversed. On the seventh night, the house itself seemed to sigh, a deep settling sound that rippled through beams and floors, and the knocking ceased entirely, replaced by a silence so complete it felt intentional, a pause before a decision. And in that silence, Margaret rose from bed and walked to the attic ladder, her movements calm and deliberate, as though following instructions only she could hear. Eliza woke to the sound of the ladder creaking and ran after her, calling her name, begging her to stop. But Margaret did not respond, climbing steadily into the darkness above, where the air was thick and cold and smelled strongly now of that copper sweetness. And when Eliza followed, heart pounding, candle held high, she found the attic transformed. Its low ceiling and cramped space stretched impossibly wide, the far corners lost in shadow, and at the center of it all, a shape that was no longer content to remain undefined, its outline flickering between forms, sometimes tall and thin, sometimes crouched and heavy, and woven through it, like a thread through cloth, was the unmistakable presence of Isaac, not whole, not separate, but bound into the thing's substance, his face emerging briefly before dissolving back into the mass, his eyes meeting Eliza's for a fraction of a second, filled not with fear but with a terrible, exhausted understanding. Margaret stepped forward then, her voice calm, almost tender, as she spoke words Eliza had never heard before, words that felt old and wrong and powerful, offering herself as replacement, as correction, as continuation of a pattern that could not be broken without catastrophic cost. And in that moment, Eliza understood that the house had always demanded balance, not justice, that it did not care who paid the price so long as the price was paid, and as the shadows closed in, as the candle guttered and went out, Eliza screamed Isaac's name again and again, not in hope of rescue, but in acknowledgement, in apology, in the desperate wish that remembrance might be the only mercy left, while above them, winter pressed closer, waiting patiently for the final shape of the bargain to reveal itself. When Eliza came back to herself, she could not tell whether she had fainted or whether time itself had simply folded, because the attic was quiet again, oppressively so, and the impossible breadth of the space had collapsed back into its original, suffocating dimensions, rafters pressing low, dust motes hanging in the candleless dark like suspended ash, and the only sound was her own breathing, ragged and animal, scraping her throat raw as she dragged air into lungs that felt bruised from screaming. Margaret was gone. There was no dramatic sign of departure, no blood, no mark burned into the floorboards, only the faint impression of disturbed dust leading toward the far corner, where the attic's deepest shadow pooled thickly, refusing to disperse even as dawn's first grey light filtered weakly through the small gable window. Eliza crawled forward on her hands and knees, calling her cousin's name until the word lost meaning, until it was only a sound she made to keep herself from dissolving entirely. And when she reached that corner, she found nothing but the old trunk that had always been there, its iron fittings rusted, its lid warped, its lock long broken, and yet something about it felt newly significant, as though it had been waiting to be noticed all along. Inside the trunk were layers of yellowed linens and moth-eaten blankets, and beneath them a stack of papers tied with twine so brittle it snapped at her touch, revealing journals written in a cramped, careful hand that was not Margaret S., nor Eliza's, but older. The ink faded to brown, the pages fragile with age. She did not read them then, could not bring herself to sit and decipher the looping script while the house still seemed to hold its breath, but she took them anyway, clutching them to her chest as she stumbled back down the ladder, down the stairs, into the main hall where servants huddled together in terrified silence, their eyes widening at the sight of her, wild-haired and hollow-eyed, clutching a bundle like a lifeline. No one asked where Margaret was, because some answers announced themselves without words, and Eliza, who had once commanded rooms with a glance, found herself unable to speak at all, her authority draining away until she was just another trembling body in a house that no longer recognized her as its mistress. The days that followed were thick with unreality, the kind that settles after catastrophe, when routines continue not because they make sense, but because stopping would require acknowledging what has been lost, and Eliza moved through those days like a host, overseeing meals she could not eat, giving instructions she could barely hear herself speak, all the while feeling the house watch her with a new, appraising attention, as if reassessing her suitability for whatever role remained unfilled. At night, she dreamed of Margaret, not as she had been in life, but as she had been in that final moment, calm and distant, her eyes reflecting something vast and patient. And she dreamed of Isaac too, his presence no longer fragmented but whole, standing at a distance she could never cross, his expression unreadable, his silence heavier than any accusation. It was on the 5th day after Margaret's disappearance that Eliza finally opened the journals, sitting alone in the parlor with the curtains drawn against the pale winter light, her hands shaking as she untied the twine and turned the first page, and what she read there began to peel back the story of the Harrowick house layer by layer, revealing a lineage of bargains and denials that stretched back far beyond her own lifetime. The journals belonged to her great-grandmother, the first Eliza Harrowick, who had come to the land as a young bride, full of ambition and fear, and who had written with a clarity that cut through the centuries, describing the winter when the house was first built, when strange sounds began beneath the earth, when livestock sickened and children woke screaming, and when an itinerant man, neither white nor enslaved, arrived at the door and spoke of things that lived between thresholds, things that fed on imbalance and attention, things that could be contained but never destroyed. According to the journals, the bargain had been simple in its cruelty. Each winter, when the nights were longest and the boundary between worlds thinnest, the house would require a living anchor, a body placed between two others who shared blood and shelter, someone neither fully of the family nor fully outside it, someone who could absorb the thing's attention and keep it dormant until spring loosened its grip. The first Eliza had chosen an indentured servant, then an enslaved man, then another, each time convincing herself that the cost was necessary, that the alternative was unthinkable, and each time writing less and less about the human toll and more about the house's continued prosperity, the fields that yielded well, the children who survived infancy, the sense of protection that settled over the land like a blessing. Later entries spoke of refinements to the ritual, of the importance of continuity, of ensuring that the anchor understood their role well enough to accept it, and Eliza felt bile rise in her throat as she recognized Isaac in those descriptions, recognized the careful kindness, the privileges granted and withdrawn, the illusion of choice wrapped around an inescapable fate. By the time she reached the final pages, the handwriting had grown shaky, the sentences fragmented, as though the writer herself had begun to understand the enormity of what she had perpetuated, and the last entry ended abruptly, mid-thought, leaving Eliza with the unbearable knowledge that she was not the first to inherit this burden, nor would she be the last if the pattern continued. That night, the house stirred again, not with knocking or shadows, but with a low, pervasive hum that vibrated through walls and floors, a reminder that the balance had been restored only temporarily, that the thing was fed but not sated, and Eliza understood then that Margaret's sacrifice had bought them time. Nothing more, that come next winter, the house would demand again, and if Eliza did nothing, it would take what it wanted without ceremony or negotiation. The weight of that understanding pressed on her until it felt impossible to breathe, and she found herself wandering the estate at dawn, drawn toward the enslaved quarters, where life continued under a different, harsher rhythm, and where Isaac's absence was felt like a missing limb. She watched from a distance as people worked, as they whispered and glanced toward the house, and she realized with a sickening clarity that the pattern could not continue without her active participation, that the bargain required not only an offering, but a chooser, someone willing to decide whose life was worth less than the house's comfort. For the first time in her life, Eliza felt the full, suffocating weight of that power, and it terrified her more than any shadow or whisper ever had. As winter deepened, the signs grew more subtle but no less ominous, frost creeping into rooms where fires burned bright, mirrors clouding over without reason, the sense of being watched returning with a patience that felt almost indulgent, as though the house were confident she would come to the same conclusion her ancestors had reached. Eliza tried to resist, tried to imagine alternatives, writing letters to distant relatives, considering selling the land, abandoning the house entirely, but each option unraveled under scrutiny, the journal's warnings echoing in her mind about what happened when the balance was broken abruptly, about neighboring lands laid waste, about families destroyed in ways far worse than any ritualized sacrifice. The house, it seemed, was not content to be left behind. It was bound to the blood that had claimed it, and it would follow in whatever ways it could. On the first night of the new year, Eliza stood alone in the attic again. The journals spread open around her, the air thick with that familiar copper scent, and she spoke aloud for the first time since Margaret's disappearance, not to pray or plead but to acknowledge, to admit that she understood at last. And in response the shadows shifted, coalescing just enough to suggest attention, to suggest approval. In that moment, Eliza made a decision that would echo through whatever future the Harrowick name still had, a decision not to end the bargain, but to change its terms in the only way she could see, by refusing to choose another unwilling anchor, by offering herself instead when the time came, binding the house's hunger to her own bloodline in a way her ancestors had never dared. It was not a noble choice, not a clean one, but it was hers, and as she left the attic, the house seemed to settle around her, the hum fading, the shadows retreating just enough to signal acceptance, leaving Eliza to walk back down the stairs, with the knowledge that she was now living on borrowed time, that every winter would bring her closer to the moment when the house would come to collect, and that when it did, there would be no one left to scream her name in the dark, only the slow, patient silence of a place that had always been fed by sacrifice and would never, ever learn to be satisfied. By the time the second winter under Eliza's silent vow arrived, the house had learned her rhythms as intimately as she had learned its moods, and there was a terrible, almost tender symmetry in the way they watched one another, each measuring the other's resolve, each waiting to see who would falter first, because, although Eliza had spoken her decision aloud in the attic months earlier, the reality of living toward it unfolded slowly, like a sentence that revealed its meaning one word at a time. The estate continued to function, crops harvested, accounts balanced, letters written and received, but beneath that surface order ran a current of strain so constant that it became a second heartbeat in Eliza's chest, an awareness that never slept, that hummed beneath every conversation and chore, reminding her that this life was provisional, conditional, and already half-promised elsewhere. She began to notice how the house responded to her presence now, doors opening more easily for her than for anyone else, fires catching faster when she entered a room, shadows withdrawing just enough to let her pass, as though the structure itself were courting her compliance, rewarding her acceptance with small mercies that made the waiting bearable. Yet those same mercies carried an edge, because they were reminders of what the house could withdraw if she ever tried to break free, and the journal's warnings echoed in her thoughts whenever she felt tempted to imagine escape. She read those journals obsessively now, tracing the arc of her ancestors' decisions, seeing patterns she had been blind to before, the way each generation framed the bargain as temporary, as an emergency measure, as something that would surely end with them, and the way the house had patiently outlived those justifications, folding each new sacrifice into its foundation like mortar. Eliza began adding her own entries, not because she believed confession would absolve her, but because she wanted a record that did not flinch, that named the cruelty without euphemism, that acknowledged Isaac and Margaret not as abstractions in a ritual, but as people whose lives had been consumed to preserve a comfort that no longer felt worth the cost. Writing became a kind of resistance, a way of asserting that even if the outcome could not be changed, the story could, that future eyes might read her words and understand that compliance did not always mean ignorance or indifference. As winter deepened, the house tested her in subtle ways, presenting her with opportunities to revert to the old pattern. Moments when an accident or illness among the enslaved could have been quietly reframed as necessity, when the choice she had refused could have been made without spectacle or consequence. and each time Eliza felt the weight of those moments settle on her shoulders, felt the ease with which she could have justified surrendering someone else instead. It terrified her how persuasive those thoughts could be, how quickly fear sharpened into rationalization, and she understood then how her ancestors had slipped so easily into their roles, how the machinery of harm perpetuated itself not through overt monstrosity, but through a series of small, reasonable-seeming concessions. The house seemed to sense her struggle, its manifestations growing more intrusive as the solstice approached, not violent but insistent, draughts that snuffed candles at critical moments, whispers that threaded through her dreams with suggestions framed as concern, reminding her of her youth, her potential, the life she could still lead if she only reconsidered the terms she had set. Eliza responded by withdrawing further into herself, limiting her interactions, spending long hours alone in rooms where the house's presence felt least oppressive, clinging to routines that anchored her to the mundane world even as the extraordinary pressed closer. She took to walking the grounds at night, bundled against the cold, listening to the crunch of frost beneath her boots, letting the vastness of the dark fields remind her that the house, for all its power, occupied only a small piece of the world, that there were places beyond its reach, even if she herself might never see them. It was during one of these walks that she encountered old Nathaniel, an enslaved man whose age had placed him beyond the heaviest labor but not beyond notice, and who had served the family long enough to have known Eliza as a child, to have seen the seasons of the house shift and repeat with weary familiarity. He did not bow or avert his eyes when he saw her standing there under the bare branches of the oak near the river, and something in his steady gaze made Eliza pause, made her realize that whatever secrets she believed herself to carry alone were never as hidden as she imagined. Without prompting, Nathaniel spoke of winters past, of nights when the house seemed to breathe, of people who had disappeared without explanation, and as he spoke, Eliza felt the last of her illusions about solitude dissolve, replaced by a dawning understanding that the bargain's consequences had always rippled outward, shaping lives far beyond the narrow circle her ancestors had acknowledged. Natha. Neil did not accuse her, did not beg, but his words carried an implicit question, one that lingered long after they parted, about what it meant to choose oneself over others when the structure that enabled that choice was itself built on injustice. That encounter hardened Eliza's resolve even as it deepened her dread, because it stripped away the comforting fiction that her sacrifice would be contained, that her death would neatly balance the scales, and left her with the more unsettling truth that nothing about this legacy could be clean. As the solstice arrived, the house's hunger sharpened into something almost palpable, a pressure that made the air feel thick, that drew Eliza inexorably back toward the attic, where the bargain had always been sealed, and she prepared herself with a strange calm, putting her affairs in order not in anticipation of immediate death, but in recognition that the line she had crossed could not be uncrossed, that every step from this point forward moved her closer to an end she had chosen and yet could not fully imagine. She wrote letters she did not send, spoke apologies aloud to empty rooms, and in moments of weakness allowed herself to remember Isaac not as an anchor or a victim, but as a man with warmth and humor, whose presence had once made the long winters bearable, whose loss had cracked open a space in her life that no vow could fill. On the longest night, when the house seemed to draw itself inward, holding its breath, Eliza climbed to the attic and sat among the journals, the silence so complete it rang in her ears, and for the first time the shadows gathered without resistance, forming not a figure but a sense of attention so focused it felt like a hand at the small of her back. She did not speak this time, did not need to, because the house already knew her answer, and as the night stretched on, Eliza felt something shift, not a taking but a binding, a tightening of threads that wrapped her more firmly into the fabric of the place than any ancestor before her. When dawn finally broke, pale and cold, she descended the ladder with the knowledge that the bargain had been amended but not concluded, that she had not yet paid the full price, but had agreed to its inevitability, and that the house, satisfied for now, would grant her another year, another cycle, in which to live with the consequences of her choice. The servants noticed the change in her after that night. the way her movements grew more deliberate, the way her gaze lingered on details as though she were memorizing them, and though no one spoke openly of it, a quiet understanding settled over the estate that Miss Eliza Harrowick belonged to the house now in a way that went beyond ownership, that whatever force had claimed others before had finally claimed one of its own, and as winter loosened its grip and spring crept back into the fields, Eliza carried that understanding with her like a second skin, knowing that the story was far from over, that the house's patience was not mercy, and that each passing season was both a gift and a countdown, ticking steadily toward the moment when the balance would demand more than intention, more than words written in a journal, and would finally ask her to step fully into the darkness she had spent her life trying to keep at bay. Spring did not arrive all at once, but seeped into the estate in hesitant gestures, thin green shoots pressing through thawing soil, birds testing the air with uncertain calls, and Eliza moved through those changes with a heightened awareness that bordered on reverence, because each sign of renewal felt less like a promise and more like a reminder of time slipping forward, of the invisible ledger the house kept marking her days with quiet precision, and she felt herself living in a narrowing corridor where every ordinary moment carried the weight of impending significance, where even laughter sounded provisional, as if it might be the last time she allowed herself ease. The house, having secured its amended bargain, withdrew its more overt pressures, settling into a watchful stillness that was in many ways more unsettling than the whispers and drafts had been, because its silence suggested confidence, a certainty that Eliza would not, could not, deviate from the path she had chosen, and this certainty followed her everywhere, into the garden paths where she once walked without thinking, into the dining room where meals now tasted faintly of ash, no matter how carefully they were prepared, into her bedroom where sleep came in fragments filled with dreams that blurred memory and premonition into a single, indistinguishable thread. She began to feel herself changing in ways she struggled to articulate, not physically, but in the shape of her thoughts, the way her mind returned again and again to questions of legacy and consequence, of what it meant to be remembered, and who controlled that remembering, and she found herself speaking less, listening more, as though she were already half ghost, already practicing the attentiveness required of someone who would soon belong to the house, rather than merely inhabit it. It was during this uneasy spring that word reached the estate of disturbances beyond its boundaries, rumors of unrest along the river, of enslaved people vanishing from neighboring plantations, of patrols finding signs of camps abandoned in haste, and though such stories were not new, Eliza sensed a different tenor beneath them, a current of possibility that stirred something dangerous and hopeful in equal measure, because for the first time she considered that the house's dominion, long assumed to be absolute, might not be as complete as it claimed. She did not voice these thoughts, not even in her journal, but they colored her interactions, lent an edge to her conversations with overseers and neighbors, and when she encountered old Nathaniel again, this time near the barns where preparations for planting were underway, she saw in his eyes the same cautious alertness, the same awareness that the world beyond the estate was shifting in subtle but consequential ways. Their exchanges grew more frequent, more layered, never explicitly conspiratorial yet laden with shared understanding, and Eliza found herself relying on him in ways that blurred the lines of propriety her upbringing had drilled into her, asking questions she would never have asked before, listening to stories that revealed the plantation's history from angles she had never been taught to consider. Through Nathaniel, she began to understand how the house's hunger had been felt not only in disappearances and whispered rituals, but in the daily grind of fear and resignation that shaped the lives of those forced to labor under its shadow, and this understanding deepened her resolve even as it sharpened her pain, because it made clear that her own impending sacrifice, however sincerely intended, could not erase the damage already done. As summer approached, the heat settled over the estate with oppressive intensity, pressing down on roofs and fields alike, and the house seemed to respond to this abundance with a subtle tightening, its rooms growing warmer, its corridors more confining, as though it were drawing Eliza inward, encouraging her to spend more time inside, away from the expansive sky and the tantalizing rumors of movement beyond its walls. She resisted this pull as best she could, throwing herself into tasks that took her outdoors, riding the perimeter of the property, supervising work in the fields, lingering near the river where the water's slow, relentless flow reminded her that even the most entrenched structures were subject to erosion. It was on one such afternoon, standing at the river's edge with the sun beating down and cicadas droning in the trees, that she noticed something amiss, a sense of absence she could not immediately place, until she realized that Nathaniel had not appeared for several days. His steady presence suddenly, unnervingly gone. Questions yielded evasions, shrugs, claims of illness or reassignment, but Eliza's unease grew with each half-answer, because she recognized the pattern too well, recognized the way the estate closed ranks around an inconvenient truth, and as she pressed harder, she felt the house's attention snap back into focus, a cold awareness that wrapped around her like a warning. That night, sleep abandoned her entirely, replaced by a restless pacing that carried her from room to room, and in the deepest hours before dawn, when the world outside lay hushed and expectant, she heard it again, not a whisper this time, but a low, resonant vibration that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, a sound that thrummed in her bones and made her heart race with a mixture of fear and anger, because she understood now that the house was not merely waiting but intervening, shaping events to ensure its continued dominance. The realization ignited something fierce within her, a refusal that went beyond her earlier vow, because this was no longer about her alone, no longer a solitary reckoning with inherited sin, but an active struggle against a force that continued to harm others even as it prepared to claim her, and in that moment, Eliza made a decision that would irrevocably alter the course of her story. She returned to the attic at first light, not to sit in resignation among the journals, but to search them with new intent, scanning for overlooked details, for references to resistance rather than compliance, and in the brittle pages of an ancestor's cramped handwriting, she found mention of a failed attempt generations earlier, a footnote in the house's long history that spoke of a Harowick who had tried to break the cycle by denying the house both sacrifice and succession, an attempt that ended in disaster, but left behind tantalizing hints of vulnerability, of a binding that relied not only on blood, but on belief. Eliza seized on this possibility with a desperation that bordered on obsession, piecing together fragments, cross-referencing entries, reconstructing a theory that suggested the house's power was sustained as much by the family's acceptance of its terms as by any inherent supernatural force, and if that acceptance could be publicly, unequivocally withdrawn, if the narrative that framed the bargain as necessary could be shattered, then the house might weaken, might lose its grip. The implications were staggering, terrifying, because they demanded not a quiet, dignified sacrifice, but an open confrontation that would expose the estate's secrets to a world already primed for upheaval, and Eliza understood that pursuing this path would place her in direct conflict not only with the house, but with the social order that had allowed it to thrive. Even so, she could not turn away, and as she began to plan, to consider allies and strategies, she felt a strange exhilaration take root beneath her fear, a sense that for the first time her actions might ripple outward rather than inward, might challenge the darkness instead of accommodating it. The disappearance of Nathaniel lent urgency to her efforts, and though she could not confirm his fate, she carried the weight of his absence like a vow, a promise that whatever came next would not be undertaken lightly or solely in her own name. By the time summer reached its peak, Eliza had committed herself fully to this dangerous course, gathering documents, rehearsing the truth she would speak, steeling herself for the backlash she knew would follow, and all the while the house watched, its silence growing taut, its patience thinning, as if it sensed that the amended bargain was slipping, that the girl it had bound was transforming into something far more threatening than it had anticipated. The nights grew heavier, dreams more vivid and unsettling, filled with images of doors flung open, of light flooding spaces long kept dark, of voices raised in fear. NCE, rather than whispered in fear, and though Eliza woke each morning exhausted, she also woke resolute, aware that she was moving toward a confrontation that would test not only her courage, but the very foundations of the life she had known. In the suffocating heat of late summer, As thunderheads gathered on the horizon and the air crackled with unspent energy, Eliza stood on the threshold of action, knowing that once she crossed it, there would be no retreat, that the house would respond with everything at its disposal, and that the cost of challenging a legacy built on silence and sacrifice would be measured not only in her own suffering, but in the fates of those she sought to protect. Yet even with this knowledge pressing down on her, she felt a clarity she had never known before, a conviction that whatever darkness lay ahead, it was better to walk into it with eyes open and voice raised than to be swallowed quietly by the walls that had claimed so many before her. The day Eliza chose to speak was not marked by ceremony, but by a strange, oppressive calm that settled over the estate like a held breath, the kind of quiet that comes before a storm tears the sky apart, and she felt it from the moment she woke, a pressure behind her eyes, a tension in the air that made even the servants move more softly, as if the house itself were listening, waiting to see whether she would falter at the final threshold. She dressed without assistance, choosing a simple dark gown rather than the elaborate attire expected of her position, because this was not a performance of refinement, but an act of rupture, and as she descended the staircase, each step felt weighted with generations of expectation, each creak of the wood sounding like a question asked by the past. Word had already spread that she intended to address the gathered families, the overseers, the local magistrate, and the clergy who had been invited under the pretense of discussing plantation security, and the courtyard filled steadily under the relentless sun, faces flushed with heat and curiosity, some amused, some irritated, others faintly uneasy, as though they sensed that whatever Eliza intended to say would not conform to the polite grievances and measured appeals they were accustomed to hearing from a young woman of her station. The house loomed behind her, its windows dark and unreadable, and as she stepped forward to the makeshift platform, she felt a ripple pass through the structure, a subtle shudder that traveled through stone and timber alike, a warning that it understood what was about to happen and did not approve. But she did not stop, could not stop, because the words had been building inside her for months, years even, pressing against her ribs like a second heart, and now that she stood before this assembly, she felt an unexpected steadiness settle over her, a clarity sharpened by the knowledge that silence had already exacted too high a price. She began not with accusation but with history, recounting the founding of the estate, the pride with which her ancestors had spoken of prosperity wrested from unforgiving land, the careful omission of the costs borne by others, and as she spoke, murmurs rippled through the crowd, some listeners nodding along in agreement, others shifting uncomfortably as her narrative took on a sharper edge, threading together ledger entries, medical records, burial plots that did not align with official accounts, and the stories whispered among the enslaved that had never been granted legitimacy, but had endured nonetheless. She named names, not with theatrical flourish, but with precise, devastating calm, detailing the disappearances, the unexplained deaths, the bargains struck in private rooms under the guise of necessity, and as the truth unfolded, she could feel the house reacting, the air thickening, a low vibration humming beneath her feet, but she pressed on, voice steady even as her hands trembled, because she understood now that AR thrived on fragmentation, on stories told in isolation and dismissed as rumor, and by weaving them together in public, she was stripping the darkness of one of its most potent weapons. Gasps and protests erupted as she described the rituals, the belief that the house required sacrifice to sustain the family's fortunes, and when she spoke of the bloodline's role in perpetuating that belief, in teaching each generation to accept it as immutable fact, a sharp cry rose from somewhere in the crowd, a denial shouted with such vehemence that it bordered on panic. But Eliza did not flinch, did not yield the floor, instead meeting the outburst with a gaze that was almost sorrowful, because she recognized in that reaction the same terror she herself had felt, the terror of realizing that what had been presented as fate was in fact a choice. As she reached the heart of her speech, the declaration that she rejected the bargain entirely, that she refused both sacrifice and succession, the house's response intensified, a sudden gust of wind tearing through the courtyard, banners snapping, dust swirling, and for a moment it seemed as though the structure might physically lunge forward, might collapse inward or outward in some violent attempt to reassert control, and cries of alarm broke out as people stumbled back, clutching hats and skirts, eyes wide with fear. Eliza felt the force of it like a hand at her throat, an invisible pressure that threatened to silence her at the most crucial moment, but she forced the final words out anyway, proclaiming that the house held no power she did not grant it, that its hunger was sustained by belief and secrecy, and that in speaking openly she was withdrawing both. And as those words left her mouth, something shifted, not with the dramatic finality of an explosion, but with a deep, resonant cracking that echoed through the estate, a sound like ice breaking on a river, signaling not immediate destruction, but the beginning of irreversible change. The crowd erupted into chaos, voices overlapping in disbelief, anger, fear, and fascination, some demanding explanations, others calling for restraint, a few already moving away as though eager to distance themselves from whatever curse they feared might now be unleashed. And through it all, Eliza stood unmoving, heart hammering, lungs burning, aware that she had crossed a line from which there was no return. The house's fury did not manifest as immediate violence, but as a suffocating heaviness that settled over the grounds, a sense of being watched multiplied 100-fold. And as the gathering dispersed in disarray, Eliza felt a wave of exhaustion crash over her, the adrenaline that had sustained her draining away to leave her trembling and weak. She was escorted back inside by a pair of servants whose expressions were unreadable, and as the doors closed behind her, the familiar corridors seemed altered, narrower, darker, the walls pressing in with a palpable hostility that made each step an effort. And she realized that the confrontation she had staged in public was only the beginning, that the house, wounded and enraged, would not relinquish its hold without a struggle. That night, the estate became a crucible of unrest. Objects rattling without cause, doors slamming, cold drafts sweeping through rooms despite the heat, and Eliza endured it all with a grim determination, refusing to flee even when instinct screamed at her to run, because she knew that abandonment would only confirm the house's narrative of inevitability. As the hours wore on, she felt herself slipping in and out of consciousness, besieged by visions that blurred past and present, ancestors staring down at her with expressions ranging from fury to awe, the faces of the vanished and the dead rising from the walls like shadows cast by an unseen fire, and through it all, a single question pulsed with relentless insistence. Would she recant? Would she beg forgiveness? Would she restore the barg? Aim to preserve herself? Each time the question surfaced, she answered it with silence, a refusal that grew stronger with repetition, and gradually, almost imperceptibly, the house's assaults shifted in character, less frantic, more probing, as though it were testing her resolve, searching for a crack through which it might reassert dominance. Near dawn, when the darkness thinned and the first pale light seeped into the sky, Eliza felt a change, a loosening of the oppressive pressure, and though the house still loomed, still radiated menace, it no longer felt omnipotent, and in that fragile reprieve, she sensed that her gamble had not been in vain, that belief, once withdrawn, could not be easily reclaimed. The cost of her defiance became apparent as the day progressed, as messengers arrived bearing news of retaliation, of neighbors severing ties, of legal challenges and whispered accusations intended to discredit her, and as she learned that some of the enslaved had been moved abruptly under cover of night, their whereabouts unknown, a reminder that the system she sought to dismantle would not collapse neatly or bloodlessly. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her with renewed force, but unlike before, it was not accompanied by the paralyzing sense of inevitability the house had cultivated. Instead, it felt like a burden chosen knowingly, a burden she bore in solidarity with those whose lives had been shaped by far harsher choices imposed without consent. In the days that followed, as the estate oscillated between uneasy quiet and violent outbursts, Eliza remained vigilant, documenting everything, preparing for the next phase of the struggle, because she understood now that breaking the silence was only the first step, that dismantling a legacy built on fear would require sustained resistance, alliances forged in defiance of convention, and a willingness to endure loss without surrendering the truth she had finally brought into the light, and as she stood at her window one evening, watching a storm gather over the hills, lightning flickering like veins of fire through the clouds, she felt a grim, resolute calm settle over her, the knowledge that whatever the house attempted next, it would face not a solitary heir bound by tradition, but a woman who had named it, challenged it, and refused to believe in its inevitability any longer. By the time the storm finally broke, it felt less like weather and more like a reckoning, thunder rolling over the hills with a slow, deliberate menace as rain lashed the estate and turned the dirt paths into dark, churning veins. And Eliza stood at the window long after sensible fear should have driven her away, watching lightning split the sky and illuminate the house in harsh, unforgiving flashes that revealed every crack, every stain, every warped beam that generations of careful maintenance had failed to truly conceal, because rot, she understood now, could be disguised but never erased. The night carried a sense of culmination, as though all the restless energies she had stirred were converging toward a single decisive moment, and when the first tremor ran through the floors beneath her feet, she did not startle, did not cry out, but closed her eyes and breathed through the fear, anchoring herself in the knowledge that this was the confrontation she had been moving toward since the moment she chose truth over inheritance. The house responded with fury stripped of subtlety, walls groaning, doors bursting open and slamming shut, portraits crashing to the floor in showers of shattered glass, and as Eliza moved through the corridors, lantern held high, she felt the weight of countless eyes upon her, the presence that had once whispered and manipulated now roaring in frustration at her refusal to submit. It was in the central hall, beneath the great staircase that had borne generations of heirs, that the manifestation reached its peak, the air turning bitterly cold, as shadows pooled twisted into forms that were not quite human, echoes of ancestors and victims alike, their features blurred but their suffering unmistakable, and for a moment Eliza faltered, overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of what had been done in this place, the countless lives reduced to instruments in a legacy of fear. Yet even as despair threatened to claim her, another sensation rose beneath it, quieter but stronger, a sense of presence that did not seek to dominate but to bear witness, the accumulated resilience of those who had endured without ever being allowed to speak, and it steadied her, reminded her that she was not alone, that the story she had begun to tell could not be unspoken now. She addressed the house not with the defiance of her earlier declaration, but with a measured, resolute clarity, naming the harm, acknowledging the dead, and refusing once again to participate in the cycle, and, as she spoke, the shadows recoiled, the temperature rose incrementally, and the roaring diminished to a low, wounded keening that vibrated through the beams and floorboards. The storm outside reached a crescendo at that moment, a thunderclap so violent it seemed to strike the house itself, and the force of it sent Eliza sprawling to the ground, lanterns skittering away to extinguish against the stone, plunging the hall into darkness broken only by the intermittent glare of lightning. In that strobing light, she saw the final unraveling begin, cracks racing up the walls like veins, the grand staircase sagging, the portraits along the landing splitting down the middle, and she understood that the house's power had always been contingent, dependent on belief, secrecy, and continuity, and that by severing those threads, she had rendered it incapable of sustaining itself. When the structure finally gave way, it did so not in a single catastrophic collapse, but in a series of groaning, agonized shifts, sections sagging and splitting, as though the house were tearing itself apart from the inside, and Eliza dragged herself toward the nearest exit, lungs burning, heart pounding, driven by instinct even as part of her felt compelled to stay and witness the end. She emerged into the rain just as a portion of the roof caved in with a deafening roar, sending up a plume of dust and debris that mingled with the downpour, and she fell to her knees in the mud, gasping, soaked to the skin, watching as the edifice that had dominated her life was reduced to a wounded ruin silhouetted against the storm. Dawn found her still there, exhausted beyond measure, as the rain tapered off and the sky lightened to a washed-out grey, revealing the extent of the damage, walls collapsed, wings partially destroyed, the once imposing structure now a fractured carcass that looked smaller, less formidable in the clear light of morning, and as people cautiously emerged from nearby buildings and gathered at a distance, whispers spreading like ripples through water, Eliza felt a profound, aching grief mingle with an equally profound relief. The aftermath was not neat or triumphant, and the days that followed were filled with legal battles, accusations, and the slow, painful work of accountability, as investigators uncovered evidence long hidden, as families confronted truths they had preferred to ignore, and as the enslaved seized what opportunities they could to escape or assert claims that had been denied for generations. Eliza became a lightning rod for both praise and condemnation, hailed by some as courageous, reviled by others as a traitor to her class and bloodline, and she accepted both with a weary equanimity, understanding that narratives would fracture and reform around her actions, just as the house had fractured around its own lies. She dedicated herself to ensuring that what could be salvaged from the wreckage served a different purpose, that the land would no longer be a monument to exploitation but a site of reckoning and remembrance, and though progress was slow, and often met with resistance, she persisted, driven by the knowledge that dismantling a system built over centuries could not be accomplished in a single dramatic night. Years later, when the ruins had been overtaken by vines and the memory of the house's former grandeur had faded into something closer to myth, travelers would still pause at the edge of the property, reporting a strange heaviness in the air, a sense of sorrow and release intertwined, and locals would tell different versions of the story, some emphasizing the curse, others the courage, but all acknowledging that something had ended there, something that had fed on silence and obedience until it finally starved. Eliza herself did not remain, choosing instead a quieter life dedicated to advocacy and documentation, ensuring that the names and stories of those who had suffered were recorded, spoken, and taught, so that the pattern could not repeat itself unnoticed. And when she spoke of the house in later years, she did so not with bitterness, but with a sober understanding of how easily evil could masquerade as tradition when left unchallenged. And now, as this story reaches its end, consider what it asks of us as listeners, as inheritors of histories we did not choose but must still confront, and if this tale of silence broken and power undone has held you, unsettled you, or made you question the shadows that linger in your own world, make sure you subscribe to Born into Darkness, hit the bell icon so you never miss the next descent into forgotten horrors, and leave a comment telling us just how deeply this story reached you, because every time we speak these stories aloud, every time we refuse to let them fade back into the dark, we weaken the hold of the things that thrive there, and together, we ensure they never go unanswered again.